Hi everyone, I'm Jessica from ArtbyPanza and welcome to my tutorial for a monochrome Milky Way landscape. I've got a few materials here, so I'll walk you through them. I've got an A5 sheet of paper. It's 100% cotton and cold pressed, 300 GSM or 140 pound. I like this paper because it doesn't buckle as much as thinner paper. I've got a few brushes here. I might not use all of them, but I'll walk you through them once I'm using them. I do have a wash brush. I've got a round 8, a round 6, a round 2, and a detail brush, so 2/0. I've got washi tape to tape down my paper. I've got a dropper, Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, a paper towel, 2 cups of water, 1 for dirty, 1 for clean water, and the paint I'm going to be using today is the Aloha Studios Moana. It's a nice Prussian blue. It's probably one of my favorites. As you can see, I'm slowly starting to run out. So let's get into it. And the reason I'm using washi tape is just because the masking tape I have at the moment is tearing all of my paper. The first thing I'm going to do is lay down a wash of water. So I'm using this wash brush. It's just a cheap brush. I got it from my local stationery store, not even an art store, so they're pretty common. It's a no brand. It has a brand. It's J. Burroughs 35mm, but you can use whichever brush you like. You can even use a round brush. I just find that this doesn't take as long to lay down the wash of water. You want your paper to be quite wet. It shouldn't be, pooling. There should be no puddles of water. If you do see any puddles of water, all you need to do is just grab a paper towel and mop them up. If you're struggling to know if your paper is wet enough, if you just hold it to the light, you should see that it's all glistening. And that's fine. That's what we want. So I've got my colour here. I've got a palette off to the side, and I'm going to just activate the colour. So what we want to do here is we want to work from dark to light. So we want to go from a nice gradient, dark to light. So I'm going to try to get a decent amount of colour on my brush, and we're going to lay that down. Now, this isn't all final. I'm going to come back to this a couple of times and darken areas. So we just need to get, the basic layer down. I do like to keep the very base of my paper a bit darker, just so that the trees aren't standing out so much that they look like they're just in the middle of nowhere. So let's work on getting the top a bit darker. Keep in mind that watercolor also does dry lighter. So I wouldn't be worried about anything looking too dark. It is going to lighten up as it dries. I'd argue that with a night sky, nothing is too dark. The night sky almost looks black, so you want that effect. Now I've just cleaned my brush in some water and just quickly dabbed it on a bit of paper towel just to take the excess water off, and I'm just slowly going over the whole piece and just bringing that colour up. All right, so I think we've got a good wash of color here. So I'm just going to dip my brush in the clean water. Make sure it's quite full of water. It's not dripping, but it's full of water. So now I'm just going in and dabbing in drops of water, and the water is actually just going to move the pigment away and create this exploding kind of blooming effect. So you want some big drops of water, you want some little. They're all going to give different effects. I like to do mine straight, but you can do yours on an angle, whichever way you like. You can even go in with more water into the same areas, and it will continue to push that pigment away. I recommend just doing this at your artistic discretion. You don't have to do a lot of drops if that's not the look that you're going for. I would also recommend just getting a piece of scrap paper and just experimenting with the colour and just seeing how it actually reacts to having water dropped into it. Does it not push the colour away? Some pigments take a bit more effort. Sometimes you might be having a problem of the colour not being pushed away because you don't have enough water on your brush. So just practice all of this. Alright. So I feel like I've got a little bit of pooling in the centre. Can you see where it's kind of dragging down? I'm just going to go in and just pick up some of that water. Now I'm going to get a smaller brush. I've got my round 2 here. I'm going to get a little bit more pigment, and I'm actually just going to go into the middle and lay down some colour. And this gives it a really nice effect. You can go in and blend out the colour so that it doesn't look like a harsh line. I wouldn't recommend doing too much of this. I find it can look a little bit forced if you go too far. Like there is kind of a point where enough is enough. Just play around with it. It's all experimentation. As you continue with this kind of method, you'll realise, yep, that's enough. Now I'm going to go back in again with some water droplets. The paper is starting to dry, and you'll start to get a little bit of a stronger effect as the paint starts to dry on the paper. So I'm going to wait for this to dry before I do the trees, but I am going to go in and do some stars. So I've got my bleed proof white here. I really like using this because it is really, really strong. So I'm just going to get some water on my brush. I tend to just use the cap here, and you do need to water this down. It is quite a thick ink. Okay, so I'm going to go in and drop a few stars around. I'm going to even drop a little bit in this Milky Way. I'm going to blend that out in just a moment. I do like to go in a little bit and lay down some splatter here, not too much, just a little bit, and because it's still wet, it is going to bleed out a little bit. So I've just loaded my brush with the bleed proof white, and I'm just tapping my brush. Okay, so just going to get some water on my brush, not too much, and I'm just blending out some of this white that's not bled out on its own, just because the water is drying up. Sorry, the paper is drying up. I'm going to even go over these stars here. Now, dropping in the bleed proof white in a few select highlight spots is going to really give it a nice effect as it dries, because I'm going to go back in and add more bleed proof white here. So these stars will look like they're shining stars. Okay. So once you're happy with everything, just leave it to dry. You can use a hair dryer, you can use a heat embossing tool, or you can just let it dry on its own. Just depends how patient you are. I might just actually go in and just add a little bit more of this Moana. Okay, so now that our painting has dried, we're going to add in the stars and the trees. I'm going to add in the stars first, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover this bottom area, just because I don't want stars to be covering the trees. So I just cover this bottom area. This gets quite messy, so I'm just going to move some stuff away. Now, I've got my round 2. I've still got the bleed proof white that I've mixed up. Now you just want to load your brush as best as you can. And you just want to tap the brush. So most of the stars are going to be in this Milky Way area, so you do want to get that quite dense. Now, depending on how much water versus pigment you have on your brush, you're either going to get larger or smaller stars. So a finer splatter or a thicker splatter. So I usually do this a few times just until I feel like we've got enough stars. I like to do it this way as opposed to putting in all of the stars manually with a gel pen or a brush for that matter, just because I feel like the stars need to be quite scattered. And I'm going to move this a little bit lower and just put a few stars, just so it doesn't look like there's a harsh line of stars before the trees. Once I've got the stars in, I think I've got enough here. Let's just put a little bit more in the Milky Way. Cool. So I'm going to go in and really highlight those stars that I've put in over here. So I'm going to put some dots of the bleed proof white. I'm going to put it here as well where I've accidentally touched the paper while it was wet. You can put a couple in the Milky Way, it's not necessary. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my detailing brush. So this is my 2/0 sable round. It's got a very fine point to it. I'm going to get a little bit of extra bleed proof white here. Alright, so I've just loaded the bleed proof white on my brush. I'm going to go in and basically I'm just adding across and then another cross on the inside for shining stars. So I'm not going to do all of them like this. I'll do some that are just little crosses like this. I might even leave some. This is all just at your own discretion. I put a couple in here. Now you don't want too much of this white on your brush just because it will go really thick and you won't get those nice thin lines for the stars. I would just suggest that if you can see any of the pigment falling, any of the paint falling, that's too much. Just dab it off to the side if that's the case. You can even go in and just add a few intentional larger stars, just larger dots in areas you feel need them. And I'm going to leave it at that. So I'm going to dry this and then we're going to get working on our stars. Okay, so now that I've dried my star layer, I'm going to get working on the trees. Now there's a few ways that you can do trees. If you need to practice them, I would recommend practicing just on a piece of scrap paper. I'll show you quickly exactly what it is that I'm doing. So basically all I'm doing is I'm going to go in, I'll just move these out of the way. And with different values, I'm going to draw a straight line. And you can do this quite a few different ways. So what I generally do is I like to just dab my brush around. I do use a detailing brush for this. Keep in mind that trees aren't a perfect triangle down. So you will have some that look like that. You'll also have some that are quite bare. So you might have a few branches here, some smaller ones, and they're quite bare. You can even go even further and just have branches like that. I don't generally do this, but you can also go in and add trees off these branches that you've just created if you don't like that. So, I'm going to do about 3 layers. So I usually just drop a little bit of water, clean water into one of the wells in my palette. And I add a bit of pigment. So you want to start off light to dark. The trees that are the lightest are the trees that are the furthest away. So let's get started. You want to again make sure that there's not too much paint or water on the brush, otherwise you won't get a thin line like this. So I'm just going to go downwards and I'm just going to be very scattered. Sometimes I do a line and then I add a couple dabs around here for extra leaves. Because these are in the back, they don't need to be super detailed, so don't stress about getting them looking perfect. Also, this is something that takes practice. It took me a long time before my trees even resembled trees, to be honest. And you want to vary the sizes of the trees, how full they are. And space them out so it looks a bit random. You don't want to have 4 of the same size trees in a row. You want to change it up because nature isn't perfect, it is random. You can get some big ones. These back ones are very light. I might even go a 4th layer. Because there's only a little bit of water on the brush, it will dry pretty fast. So I'll just do 2 more down here. Okay. Now let's get some more pigment. I put a bit too much water just in that well. So let's bring it into a new well. And the only reason I did add in water initially with a dropper is because this detail brush doesn't hold a lot of water. Alright, so let's go back in and go for this second layer of trees. I believe that it's quite important to layer the trees because you need to convey depth. Otherwise the painting will just look a bit flat. Alright, let's add in some more pigment. So in this bottom area, I had too much water and paint on my brush and it's just created this blob. So I'm going to go back in and fill in this tree a little bit more just so that doesn't look too out of place. And then I'll do a final detail layer with much more pigment than water. It's basically going to be almost all pigment. So now I'm actually going to work straight out of my well. So I've got some water. You do still need enough water that the paint has activated, otherwise you'll just get a dry brush stroke and it just won't work. And don't be afraid to put water into the well or to the pan of paint, because you can just keep adding water but you're constantly pulling pigment into the water. So even though you might have a bit of water in the well, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get the darkest value possible. So I do like to put in a few trees with this darkest value, or do like to make them a bit bigger, I should say. And a last final touch that I do like to do lately, you don't have to do this, but I do actually like to go in with a bit of paint and splatter some stars. Just for a different kind of interest. But that's completely optional. Alright, and that's it. We've got our monochrome Milky Way landscape. I hope you have enjoyed the class, and if you have any questions at all, please head over to my Instagram, ArtbyPanza, and let me know. Send me a message, and I hope you've enjoyed, and I can't wait to see what you create. Bye!